Bitch, where's my money? If you want to help me out, you can subscribe to me on Patreon, which is Grimachu, on Subscribestar, which is Grim-Jim, or if you want to make a one-off donation to help support me and keep the channel going, you can do so at paypal.me/JDesborough. Thanks. Hello all, there's a lot to get through because I haven't been making as many videos lately, so let's try and get through it, I suppose. First thing to talk about, obviously, is Trump is out. Phew. Biden's in. Give him a chance, I suppose. But a return to the status quo, a return to normality, doesn't deal with any of the underlying problems that gave you Trump. And it's not like this is a particularly new problem in the States. Obama came in on a wave of populism, promising hope and change, and delivered neither. Then Trump came in, appealing to a slightly different base, though there was a lot of crossover in terms of votes and so on. He came in promising all sorts of things, didn't deliver. So this dissatisfaction with the status quo is still there. I think Trump has scared a lot of people back to the centre, but sooner or later someone is going to come along, either on what passes for America's left or from America's hard right, who will actually follow through somehow in some way and give people what they want. And that could be good, or it could be very, 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 very bad indeed. And a lot of people are celebrating it. Yeah, I sympathise with that. A lot of other people are claiming this is the end of days. Trump wasn't the end of days, and it was a much more close-run thing with Trump than I think it will be with Biden. It's just ridiculous. But to see the same sort of over-the-top reactions on both sides now it just kind of throws everything into sharp relief. I think how stupid and tribalistic everything is. Now, I'm not saying that there's an equivalency here. Biden hasn't backed any sort of storming of the Capitol or anything, and even when more, again, what passes for left-wing elements have done similar actions, they haven't been a threat in the same way that the right-wing has. There is a disjunct between rioting and demonstrating and attacking, the very seat of your democracy. Why this is difficult for people to understand, I don't know. Both are terrible, both are bad, both shouldn't be happening, but the attack on the Capitol is far more serious in terms of government and politics and the health of your democracy than people acting out, I suppose, however more widespread and so on it is. In particular, I see a lot of people celebrating that Biden has put in a trans person in a position of power, that the vice president is a woman of colour, as if this somehow means something. And people like to claim representation matters, that it gives different points of view and so on, but you couldn't find more milquetoast establishment sort of ideas there. And just because someone has brown skin and or a vagina doesn't somehow make them enlightened and wonderful and special. Kamala Harris, for example, has a rather unpleasant past when it comes to her political decisions, her judicial decisions, when it comes to keeping people in prison or withholding evidence, that sort of thing. If you go and look for how Tulsi Gabbard took her apart during the debates, you'll see the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And coming from the UK, we now have an extremely diverse government, but it's still a conservative government. Take Priti Patel, for example. Pretty vacant. She's South Asian descent, but horrendously right-wing. And the South Asian part doesn't matter, really, does it, in terms of policy or anything else? When you've got a Home Secretary who is xenophobic and racist, it doesn't really matter what colour they are. It's not better to be treated in a horrendous way by a Home Secretary who happens to have brown skin and a vagina. The problem is the policies and the ideas that they have. She wants to bring back the death penalty, for example, wants to continue the sort of hostile atmosphere to immigration that we've had. Then there's, not sure how you pronounce this exactly, Kwasi Kwarteng, who is the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And now that we've had Brexit, he is sort of leading the charge, wanting to tear up all the workers' rights legislation that we had through the EU. So a brown person taking away your holiday, your paternity leave, your right to a fair wage, limits on your working hours and so on, it doesn't matter what colour he is. What matters is the policies. And yet people are so utterly fixated and obsessed upon those diversity points that they don't consider the politics that lies behind them, who these people are, how maybe they got their positions, how they're going to act, what they're going to bring in. Yeah, and going back to the States again, the underlying problems still remain. You've got a poverty and class issue that keeps being confused with race. You've got a white working class and underclass population that is being left behind and simultaneously blamed for everything that's wrong in the world, which only entrenches negative points of view. You've got an unofficial plutocracy and oligarchy that continues to go unaddressed. Well, that brings me on to Jimmy Dore. He had a Boogaloo boy on his show to interview, having seen a recording of them giving a short speech during one of the protests that they were involved in, and it was pretty surprising. A lot of people think he's been played, but this guy doesn't appear to be a far-right fanatic. He's gay or bisexual, he's for LGBT rights, he's for drug legalization, just seems to be anti-government. So where the crossover there is on the sort of libertarian axis. Of course, he might have been being played, Jimmy Dore, but that's really irrelevant to the greater point here, which is that if you want to persuade people, if you want to convince them of your point of view, you have to reach out to them. You have to talk to them. You have to bring them on your shows and debate and discuss and try and persuade them around to your point of view. And there probably is a lot of crossover. A lot of these white working class, underclass people who are being won over by the far right are not hearing any other messages, or if they do hear anything from the left, it's them being condemned. It's not anyone trying to create class solidarity or reach across the lines or convince them or persuade them in any way. They're just written off. And the interview that Jimmy had with the Boogaloo boy was immediately almost contrasted with an interview from someone from what passes for the American institutional left and the trade union movement, who was outraged that Jimmy had talked to this guy, despite, hopefully, probably, having listened to the interview beforehand, and just didn't seem concerned or worried about reaching out to people at all. In times of hardship, the working class, the underclass base of society tends to either go to the far right or to the far left. And if the far left isn't making any effort to persuade them, then there's no balance and no hope of getting their point of view into the ascendant whatsoever. And that's a huge risk. But there's this kind of moral purity, I suppose, that everyone keeps seeking, where the perfect is the enemy of the good. And they don't even want to try. That's not a tactic where you win. And it's a tactic where you can maintain your position on your moral high horse, but it's not a position from which you can win or push through the kinds of ideas that you want to see to improve society. And it just seeds whole swathes of the population to the far right. And that, I suppose, kind of leads us on to the free speech discussion. All kinds of platforms, even programs and so on, in which people can communicate with each other, that sell themselves as free speech platforms, though they're not necessarily free speech platforms. Gab. But they're not just being taken out of app stores, they're being removed from the internet, hosting services are being taken away. None of these things are inherently far right or right-wing. They are open platforms. If you're concerned about the amount of right-wing stuff that's on there and you're left-wing, you should probably go and join them, if you can stand it, to present your point of view on there, to dilute the far-right attitudes and so on that you see expressed there. There's an annoying thing about Americans in that they tend to regard the free speech argument as being entirely encircled by the First Amendment, which is how you get people saying it's not a free speech issue, it's not the government controlling your speech. Free speech isn't a purely American issue, it isn't a First Amendment issue, it isn't a governmental issue. Censorship started in the church, for fuck's sake, which wasn't the government, though it was as powerful. Censorship can come from anywhere. It can come from corporations, it can come from societies, social pressure, it can come from government, it can come from the church, which exerts power in other ways. It's not purely a First Amendment or a governmental issue. I mean, America isn't the whole world. There are plenty of other countries, including mine, where we still have free speech, free expression issues, but we don't have a First Amendment. So there's just this really blinkered and focused and fixated view that censorship can only be governmental and it only exists in reference to the First Amendment in the States, when nothing could be further from the truth. We need to have these alternatives. People need to be allowed to express opinions, even ones that we don't agree with. The only thing that should be a limitation, really, should be what's legal. Is this to say that Twitter and Facebook, the duopoly that they basically have over social media, that they shouldn't be allowed to control what's on their platform? They're so big, they dominate the public square so much that I think we should have extended protections there with adult walls or whatever for adult material. But should they get to enforce their political point of view? Probably not. And while people have been celebrating that the far right has been pushed off these platforms and so on, a lot of far left or pseudo left groups are also being censored, which is equally wrong. Antifa groups are being blown off Facebook and Twitter. Dirtbag left groups are being shadow banned and downlisted and so on YouTube and elsewhere, in exactly the same way that the far right is. If you welcome censorship for one group, you're welcoming it against your own points of view in the very, very near future. Let's take one example, okay? For some time, sex-negative groups have been criticizing social media platforms, particularly Twitter, because they host adult workers, sex workers, and so on. And they don't block them, and people can post adult material on Twitter within a few fairly reasonable limitations, though the blocks and bans seem to come out of nowhere. But now they seem to have found a weakness through which they can attack Twitter. They're trying to claim that Twitter is profiting off child exploitation and trafficking and so on. I don't think that's particularly true. I mean, you've got millions upon millions of users uploading stuff. Some of that is bound to be dodgy. If you report it, by and large, it gets removed. And if there's enough controversy about something, you might actually get a human being to check it rather than the bots, and it will be removed and reported to the proper authorities if there is any trafficking or child exploitation going on there. But the hysteria and the perfectly understandable massive reaction that people have to even the possibility of trafficking and child exploitation gives these people an in through which they're trying to sue Twitter to remove all adult material on the basis of this spurious and almost entirely imaginary connection between trafficking and legitimate sex work. It doesn't make any sense, but it's what's being done, is what's being pushed. And again, adult material is almost always the canary in the coal mine when it comes to free speech. So if you care about free speech, if you care about free expression, if you care about sexual expression, you should be protesting back against this. I hope to see more people commenting on it. Brexit is the other thing. Entirely predictably, it's a total fucking disaster. Fishermen were a totemic issue around Brexit, and a big thing that helped kind of push the idea of Brexit for a lot of people, despite being less than 1% of the UK economy, less than 0.1% of the UK economy, if I remember correctly. But it was this big totemic issue, and getting out of the EU was supposed to make things so much easier and better for our fishermen. What's actually happened is that now that the UK is a third country from the EU, the amount of red tape and paperwork has blown up exponentially, and it's not the EU punishing us, it's just us lapsing into the same status as any other third-party nation. Fish is rotting on the docks, being tipped into landfill, going wasted. There isn't enough demand here to meet the supply, and similar issues are happening across all industries, across all businesses, including mine. Plus there's a VAT issue where any company doing business in Britain now has to register for British tax, which is absurd and stupid. America did the similar thing some time ago. This was EU legislation that was going to come in, but has been delayed and may or may not come in. But either way, we're now outside the EU, and where it might be worth a company's while to register to do business across the EU, it's not so much worth their while to do so when it comes to Britain. And obviously, as a third-party country now, other issues come up, such as postal charges having increased exponentially, and shipping in general has slowed to a crawl between Brexit and the backing up of shipping that occurred when the new variant, the British new variant of COVID sprang up. It's a total fucking disaster, and yet hardly anyone seems prepared to admit it, and we're just seeing the blame passed on to anybody other than the Brexit cheerleaders who actually caused this to happen. So it's a total clusterfuck, but they've locked us in here with them. So personal update then, I guess. It's very hard to stay motivated at the moment. To give you some idea, there was kind of a COVID dividend in my business, publishing, role-playing games and so on. A lot of people stuck at home, had their furlough money and so on, and at the start of COVID, a lot of them spent a great deal of money. But as monetary relief has petered out, as things have got tougher for a lot of other people, they're not spending so much. And then the entire print sector of my business is almost entirely dried up at this point, meaning I've lost about a third to a half of my income. And obviously a lot of people have stepped aside from Patreon and Subscribestar and other ways of supporting me because they need the money themselves, which is all fair enough, but it does make it extremely hard not to be depressed at the whole state of things, and to feel like doing anything is worthwhile. Fortunately, I saw a lot of this coming and set aside a great deal of money, about the maximum that I'm allowed to set aside, and that'll keep me going, but it's still hard to stay motivated and to get on with projects, even ones that I'm very enthusiastic about, like Whitechester. So that's why things may have slowed down a lot. Times are tough for everybody. Zang. At the end of World War II, the Axis and the Allies went to war with A-bombs until nobody was left to fight. In this atomic wasteland, a new breed of rockabilly hero arises. From the gleaming domes of Science City Zero to the sleazy roller derbies of Vegas and the sky fortress of the Fourth Reich, there's a new world for the taking. 45, Psychobilly Retropocalypse, available at lulu.com and RPG Now.